Oh, the madness is here. The madness is here. Weather wagers time. Da 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 da. We've got it all for you.
On CBS.
Brett Thackera, Dan Tomaso, along with you, and True TV, and TNT, and TBS, and all of the fun.
And this is where having cable truly does pay off.
Yes, it does. It is going to be a week to remember here, as many of you probably off of work Thursday, Friday, and again next week.
Well, we are not.
We aren't, but some people do take off those days. They save their vacation for
holiday.
the Madness Tournament. We're going to get into all of that, but first, we want to welcome you into Weather Wagers. And a reminder, you can get us wherever you get your podcasts, and you can send us your thoughts to weatherwagers@gmail.com, and we're everywhere you are, including on YouTube. Several of you watching on there, and we appreciate that. And you can, of course, get us on Apple, Spotify, and all of the rest. But we want to get right into things here. The NCAA tournament is this week. We typically don't talk college basketball. Neither of us follow it that closely, but there were some reasons to follow it this year. A lot of big storylines, including, of course, Alabama. Not only are they good, but, of course, they've had some issues down there with the criminal charges that are going on. Also, Kentucky. John Calipari taking a lot of heat this season because, you know, he was supposed to win all these championships for Kentucky, and they've been up and down. Now, they did make the tournament. Penn State men's basketball is in. We're going to talk about that coming up. Of course, one of the reasons we don't follow it, it's an indoor sport. But you know what? Everybody and their brother and mother and sister and uncles and aunts are probably wagering on this. So, Dan, we wanted to talk about it, and you've come up with some interesting lines. I want you to pull those up, and let's. What did you come up with, and what did you find?
Well, you know, looking for close matchups. Obviously, day one, you get a lot of the 1s versus 16s, the 2s versus 15s, etc. So those tend to be huge lines.
And it's all about kind of looking for, like, which 12 seed can upset a 5, which you know, you want to try to find the upsets. I love here, and I didn't actually look at these before we
That's part of the fun.
Hit record. So I love the West Virginia Maryland pick because this is one I struggled with in filling out my bracket.
Yes.
And what's the line on this, Dan?
It is a slight favorite in the form of West Virginia by 2 points. The over/under is 137.5. So that's actually one of our lower over/unders for the matchups here, which I find interesting.
That's got to be so tough to play too. But I actually think I picked West Virginia in the bracket. Maryland's good, but they're not good enough. Obviously, Penn State beat them in a pretty big fashion and came back from a deficit against Maryland. They can be had, but this is one of those where, you know, either team probably has a chance to make a run. You just got to pick the right side of it.
And that's what makes this time of the year fun. And
okay, well, give me your pick.
Well, I'm going to go West Virginia myself. You mentioned the issue of Penn State losing out, or excuse me, them losing to Penn State.
Yep.
You know, this isn't the Maryland of 20, 30 years ago either. I mean, this is not a perennial.
Even 10 years ago.
Yeah, this is not a perennial program. West Virginia, though, actually, over the past 10 to 15 years, has had success. One of my favorite all-time college coaches is Mr. Bob Huggins. He's just he's a character. He's a character of the sport.
Well, he is, and then we move on to Charleston, San Diego State, and this is one where I'm actually going to pick the upset here. I think Charleston can do it. I think they are the 12 seed, and San Diego State makes the tournament, but everybody's talking about Charleston, and actually they're 5.5-point dogs. The over-under 141.5. Give me Charleston to win out right here.
Well, I know nothing about Charleston. In fact, I didn't know they actually had a D1 program. So this is all very interesting to me, and how it all shakes up. I'm going to take San Diego State just because.
You've heard of them?
Yeah, bigger name. That's all I know. And that's part of the fun of this is that, you know, I was saying to you earlier, there was a team in the play-in. I think it's tonight, FDU.
Yeah.
Who's that?
Well, they play basketball there, and that's the most important thing. And anybody can make a run in this tournament.
It's very true. You just got to get in.
Because I believe it was Oral Roberts that made a run just was it last year?
Or 2 years ago. I forget which. But
and guess
they're
what?
back at it.
They're back at it, and they're taking on the perennial power, the Dukies, baby.
Coach K. Less.
It's a different style team this year.
Indeed.
And certainly, I don't know if they have the talent that they have had in past years. They are 6-point favorites. I think that they can get by Oral Roberts.
It just surprised me how close it actually was, because some of these lines are about 10 to 20 points in some of the larger, you know, gaps in talent between the 16 and the 1 or the 15 and the 2. So,
would you consider actually putting money, though, on Oral Roberts to cover the 6? I mean, if they're confident.
Listen, you know, this time of the year, these games tend to be close. Absolutely.
Yeah. So our picks are both of us on West Virginia.
I go San Diego State. You go Charleston.
Yeah, and I'm going to go Duke to cover. And you're going to do it?
I'll pick Oral Roberts to cover.
Yeah. Take the
why
6.
Not?
Yeah, why not? I mean, it's certainly Maybe a few years back it would be unheard of, but I think that is a game to keep an eye
These
on.
games tend to go down to the wire, even if they are lopsided, matchups that coming in. Now, this is another fun one because, again, very small margin here.
Yeah.
Auburn and Iowa.
And I do not
8 versus 9.
Yeah, an 8 versus 9, and I don't really love Iowa. The only thing I love about
Do
Iowa,
they score less than the football team?
I don't think that's possible. But the coach of Iowa, he gave that stare down to the official
about
in a
that?
very
That-
weird moment.
That was a Twitter sensation for a while.
Fran, what's his name?
I don't know the name. I can picture him, though.
Oh,
Shiner's on.
a mane of white hair and glasses.
That's right.
But he was staring down that official. Is it? Yeah, it's Fran something. Auburn comes in with Bruce Pearl +1. If Auburn wins, they go to take on Houston in Birmingham.
Interesting.
And a lot of people felt that Houston, because they would have to play Auburn in Birmingham, would be at a disadvantage, including Houston's coach.
It's a home game.
I do like Auburn here, and I'm going to take them to win outright.
Yeah, I mean, the depth of the Big Ten has come into question a lot this year.
Yes.
So Auburn, SEC is an up-and-up conference when it comes to football.
Fran McCaffrey.
There
Yeah,
you
that's
go.
I could not think of McCaffrey. Fran McCaffrey.
Not
Kind
Fran
of an odd
Fisher
dude,
of the
but
Penn State.
No, or Fran Francilla. But, yeah, Fran McCaffrey, and he was staring down that official. I think Fran loses to Bruce Pearl and Auburn.
Okay, well, and then here's the matchup that we're going to talk about here in a few moments. Penn State, Texas A&M. Texas A&M has some clout these days, believe it or not. They spent a lot of money on their head coach, Buzz Williams. So the over-under is set at 134.5, which makes sense because Penn State doesn't score a lot of points.
No, but having said that, I think they're the hot team right now
Yes.
coming into this. Texas
Roar,
A&M,
Lions, roar.
they've got some injuries. They've got this is an interesting side of the quad of the bracket to be on. Texas A&M is 3.5-point favorites, but I think Penn State is going to win this game.
I think Penn State has a legitimate shot, but I've also known this program to come up small in big moments. It could happen again. I would love to see them move on. And now that we know that Pitt won a play-in game, there's actually a path that Penn State and Pitt could play each other.
There is. Yeah, that would be really thrilling. So who did you like in the Auburn-Iowa game again?
Give me Auburn.
Yeah, me too. And then you're going to take A&M.
I'm going to take A&M.
Yeah, and I'm going to take the Nittany Lions. So let's come back and talk about Penn State basketball. We have a conversation awaiting just ahead with Ben Jones from StateCollege.com where we will get into more of this. But I guess just a short question here for you. How exciting is it that we're in?
I think it's very exciting. I mean, they need some momentum as a program. Unfortunately, every time it seems like they've gotten some momentum, whether it's making the tournament, winning the NIT in the past 10 years, the following year is kind of a disappointment. Now, this is an older team. They have to replace players. They have to go out and recruit. But Micah Shrewsbury has proven as a head coach, at least in 2 years, that he can recruit and he can coach. So they possibly have the right man finally in place. That's been a lot to say for Penn State as a program.
It has, and I can't wait to see what they can do. But like you said, it's kind of a one-and-done squad. Can they actually make some noise?
Correct.
Some of the experts are picking them to go at least to the Sweet 16, maybe
and
farther.
Here's the thing. They play defense. They actually aren't bad as a rebounding team, and they don't turn the ball over. What they lack is size. We saw that against Purdue and Zach Edey. But even with the lack of size, they held their own.
Yeah.
After being blown out in the 2 previous matchups against Purdue, they're playing good enough basketball that they kept the rest of the Boilermakers off the court, so to speak.
Well, they did, and they had a shot to win at the end. That's
They
all
did.
that you want. So fascinating, and that game is on late Thursday night. So if you're listening, you may already know the outcome. James Franklin had a presser yesterday to
He
begin
did.
spring ball. We touch on that here coming up with Ben Jones. But quickly, Dan, our sports director, Ali Barubi, was there. Some of the friends we've had on this podcast were there. Audrey Snyder was tweeting up about it. And very quickly, one of the things that he mentioned was that Bo Pribula is getting some looks here. Your thoughts on that, or was that just a way to not necessarily keep both of them happy, but, I mean, let's be honest. If Drew Aller becomes injury-prone or gets injured,
Correct.
Nobody wants to relive that Iowa game from 2 years ago.
Well, and I saw a lot of criticism about these comments from James Franklin, but I think if you read in between the lines, it's exactly as you're saying, that you don't want the situation where the number 2 is not ready. They need reps. I mean, they both have not played a lot of football.
Bingo. And Bo Pribula didn't get in a game last year.
And Justin Smollett is the other guy that is supposedly going to get equal number of reps.
Jackson. I think.
Jackson.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He too has not played football at this level. I mean, again, it's a lot of unknowns. And if Drew Aller struggles at all,
Right.
Well, I mean, who's to say that Bo doesn't get some time to change things up a little bit? I mean, so many things are still on the table. It's early, folks. It's March.
Right. Relax. And again, we've seen what it's like when you don't have a capable backup. It was a nightmare.
Correct. And I will say this much, too. One of the other big comments that came out of this was he says Penn State will play a more traditional scrimmage this year as the blue-white game, which if you are a fan and you want to see some of this depth, in 1 month, you get to see it on a little showcase.
And he wants the stadium packed. So, yep, we're going to talk more about the football program with Ben Jones coming up. And finally, we'll bring in Mr. Shiner here. It is spring very quickly because we want to get to this interview. But, guys, it's baseball season, and the Phillies were on my TV yesterday. Just in general, what are we hearing, what are we sensing out of springtime baseball as we await the official start of the season in a couple of weeks? Let's start with you, Dan.
I will say that spring results are spring results right now. They have a little battle on the bench going on. They have a guy, last name of Cave. He's an outfielder, left-handed bat. He could win a backup role. They have Josh Harrison also likely in a backup role already. I think he's going to secure that pretty easily. But they also probably need another right-handed bat. So what kind of shakes out over the next couple of weeks, that may be the biggest position battle. But secondarily, if you're looking at the box scores, you're going to be seeing a lot of missing names right now because of the WBC, the World Baseball Classic. So Schwarber playing well for Team USA, Trey Turner, JT Realmuto, they're not in camp right now. So if you're just a casual fan checking in, that's why you're not seeing their names. Nobody in that group is hurt.
Although there is somebody who is hurt currently that
Correct.
we thought was going to make some big strides in Painter. He was throwing gas early. Everybody was so excited about him, and guess what? He's on the shelf. Now, Hopefully this isn't
What
a Tommy
do we know
Johns
there?
thing.
What kind of injury is it?
I think they were just saying some shoulder soreness.
It's a strain.
But
Not a tear.
for a guy that we were hoping was going to make the roster that now is injured, that's luckily, they were still kind of deciding whether he was really going to make his debut this year or not.
Correct.
But I think some people were really enamored with him here early in camp with how fast he was throwing the ball and what he was looking like.
And given
he's on the shelf
recovery
now.
time, he could still pitch a lot of this season.
But the spring training is where you're supposed to
Correct.
see this guy develop
Correct.
and really what we're going to see in the
Correct.
future. And now we're kind of not able to see what he's
So
able
wait
to do.
and see.
Yeah, and again, you just don't know how these guys are going to be when they get into actual game time action, which is, I go back to the Drew Alar thing, is you don't want an injury-prone guy.
Correct.
We saw that with Carson Wentz. I'm not suggesting that this is going to be the case,
Well, yeah.
but when you throw somebody in a game, look, who was the running back that kept getting? Oh, Noah Cain.
Yeah, Noah Cain.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that Painter or Al, my point is simply this:
You don't know.
have to have a plan
Yeah.
because you don't know, and certainly we hope Painter's okay. But you're right. Everybody thought he was going to make a lot of noise. We wanted to see it. That was going to be the highlight of spring training.
Correct.
And they
Yeah.
might be overly cautious now because they do know what they have in this kid.
And he was never going to pitch the full year. So
True.
that's
Now-
the other part of it.
Real quick before we get to our interview, just tell me what else you guys are hearing. Just very short in terms of we have other listeners too besides Phillies fans. But if you're around Major League Baseball, name that one team that you might be afraid of to play based on what we're seeing and hearing out of some of the early returns.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say the Braves, again, look like they have a deep team. We just saw them in spring training yesterday. They're kind of building some of their pitching depth. The team I'd be fearful of if I was on a fan base other than the Phillies is the Mets. Their injuries are piling up early.
Fearful of
Just how they're going to,
how they're going to cobble together their
right,
spring
to
their
meet these
start.
expectations. I mean, they have some pitching injuries already that are significant. Jose Quintana, a decent signing for them, could be on the shelf through July.
Wow, Shiner.
I just know some of those teams out west have been spending a lot of money. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's, anything that's going to go against the Phillies coming up, but San Diego spent a ton. Texas has spent a ton.
Correct.
So, these guys are making their $100 to $300 million deals, and they're not getting smaller. Let's put it that way.
Nope.
So that just the fact that we have Bryce under a contract that is now looking back somewhat manageable at $300 million, and Trey Turner having the contract that he does, we're
Right.
locked up, Real Muto.
Locked
I think the Phillies are actually in a better money situation than some of these other teams that are having to shell out these big numbers.
Well, and look at San Diego. They thought they had Machado on a long-term deal, but these opt-outs, really mess things up if you are trying to keep track of the books because all of a sudden he gets a huge raise, whereas Bryce Harper said, I don't want the uncertainty.
Yeah.
Lock me up for 13 years, no opt-out, and it worked out for the Phillies.
It did, and again, just keywords here: stay healthy.
That's always the case.
Everybody stay healthy. Okay, we've got an interview to get to, and one of our favorite follows on Twitter and just reading his work, Dan, is Ben Jones, and you called him up and said you would have come on the podcast, and he agreed.
And he agreed. I mean, again, this is a great time to be a Penn State sports fan, whether it's football, whether it's basketball, and we talked to Ben at length about both programs. All right, we want to welcome Ben Jones from statecollege.com. And Ben, I've been following you since I was on campus at Penn State, and I know you've been following Penn State sports that whole entire time. Has this past year been the most fun to cover with both the basketball and football teams exceeding expectations? I know State College and the fan base is all about expectations, but it seems like we got that and more this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely up there. I mean, you have to look at sort of the unexpected nature of the 2016 season for football and the excitement around Penn State in 2017. And Penn State basketball, to their credit, over that span had some good seasons. They won the NIT. They, the other year when COVID happened, I say that like it's such like a casual thing, but right before COVID, that team was really good. So there have definitely been years that have been pretty exciting, but certainly from a coverage standpoint, from the standpoint of how excited everybody gets collectively when you've got a good Penn State men's basketball team, when you've got a good football team, you're not going to turn down Rose Bowl trips. You're certainly not going to turn down NCAA tournament trips. So, yeah, I would say the excitement is definitely up there.
No doubt about it. Penn State is known for its strong academics, but maybe it's fair to say that it's becoming a top athletic university. In your opinion, and we read your stuff. A lot of our listeners read you. You've got a big following. Where do you think we are with respect to the Big Ten? Still behind Michigan and Ohio State right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways to look at it. There's probably a long answer. I think if you look at Penn State athletics top to bottom, there's definitely the argument to be made that it's one of the better holistic overall 32 team kind of athletic department. You look at places like Stanford that are, always doing really well in the Learfield Cup, which is sort of the gauge of how are you at everything. And you look at Michigan and Ohio State, and I think in particular when you look at the success that those schools have had, topically in men's basketball and some other sports, hockey, certainly some women's sports as well. Those are athletic departments to aspire to be like. From a money perspective, Penn State's bringing in as much money, especially on the football front, as these athletic departments are. I think another thing that really helps those places is that Columbus is bigger than State College. Ann Arbor is bigger than State College. It's close to Detroit. They have things to pull on that are not, available the same way that they are or might be in State College. I think that's one of the things that, Penn State basketball has struggled with over the years with the random Wednesday night game is that a lot of fans live in Harrisburg or they live in Altoona, and maybe you don't want to make that drive because it's going to be late or, because the weather's not great. And that's something that when you have a large, population center around you, it's a lot easier to find those people. But, back to the original question, certainly I think Ohio State and Michigan have set the standard of what accomplishments look like. But I think from an infrastructure standpoint, from a financial standpoint, Penn State's, pretty much right there with them.
Well, we are certainly excited to hear that, especially moving forward with both basketball and football. And, Ben, I want to ask you, so we go back to the football season, and people left the bandwagon of Sean Clifford in the middle of the season after the Michigan loss. And similarly, I feel like the basketball program went through this too. The Big Ten schedule hit, and January was pretty rough on the Nittany Lions, and a lot of people left the bandwagon, so to speak. But how did Micah Shrewsbury's squad bounce back, and do you think this is now sustainable? They've got a taste of winning. Can this keep up?
I mean, I think they bounce back because teams never give up as quickly as fans do. I mean, I think that's a big part of it. And they get better. I mean, you talk about people jumping ship or the idea of giving up on someone. For as long as I will live, I will point when people bring that up to Sam Ficken and Mike Gesicki, two guys that started out their careers not that hot. I think Sam's obviously was a little bit more straightforward than Mike's, and then they ended up both being, Mike in particular to a certain extent, being really good players for Penn State. So sometimes, the potential that you have the word prospect means that you can be this good. You can develop to be this good. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to start this good. So I think if you're Penn State basketball, you say, look, we know we're doing a lot of things well. We know we're in a lot of these games. Sometimes the ball just has to go in. Sometimes you have to play a little bit better defense. And that's what they did. They shot it a little better. They played a little bit better defense. And they didn't give up. I think if you're a team that gives up, you're a team that doesn't make the Big Ten final. If you're a team that gives up, you're not a team that erases a 17-point lead with basically no time left. These things are part of belief. And I think, it's certainly from the fan perspective, you can understand why it can be difficult to watch the slog of January and February basketball when it's maybe not the flashiest or the sexiest. But I think for basketball in particular, they just believed and they knew. And I think everybody else knew too. I think there were times earlier in the year we could see that when it all clicked, they were really good. It's just hard to win in the Big Ten. And certainly, the history of Penn State basketball doesn't always lend itself to a lot of patience from people. But I do think that this team believed and certainly, they turned out to be right.
Well, and now they're in, and I think too. All you need to do is get in, and then get hot. And to your point, have the belief that you can make a run. Penn State did make the NCAA tournament with Ed DeChellis back in 2011, and then went the entire Pat Chambers era with no appearances to show for it, other than that COVID year, which never happened because of the virus shutting things down. I believe right before the NCAA tournament that year. But was it as simple of a change as swapping out the coach with Shrewsbury, or is this season just a bit of a flash in the pan, so to speak?
I think it goes back maybe to the sustainability question that it occurs to me now that I didn't necessarily answer, but I think that the transfer portal really helps. When you look at when Pat Chambers took the job, it was right after a really old and experienced team left. It was right before the scandal happened. It was an interesting point for that program, and it takes time to find guys. I mean, for a really long time when Pat Chambers was the head coach, people just didn't pick up the phone when they called. It was Penn State. It wasn't a thing that you cared about. And that's changed. And a lot of that has changed because of Pat. Whatever his shortcomings or strengths might have been as a head coach, he opened a lot of doors for Penn State that weren't there previously. And he got them a lot of positive momentum. Now, I think obviously, the Penn State team that you see today and the recruiting that you see today isn't necessarily based out of the Philadelphia area. It kind of leans a little bit more on Micah Shrewsbury's roots in the Midwest and some other areas. But I think the transfer portal really helps because when you lose a guy like Jalen Pickett, which Penn State's going to do either in a few days or a few weeks, that's not somebody that you necessarily go out and replace with a recruit, or at least Penn State's not going to. So you've got to be able to find people in the portal that are going to be able to do some of the things that he can do. I think anytime you try and replace a good player, you're not really trying to do it one-to-one. You're just trying to get somebody that can give you some of the points and some of the rebounds and some of the assists. And I think the transfer portal helps there and development helps there. When they started out, they hired Brian Snow, the guy he used to work for, I forget now, one of the recruiting networks. He had been an evaluator for a long time. He's another guy that they can look to and say, let's go find somebody in the portal. So is it sustainable? I mean, that's been Penn State's basketball challenge for forever. It's not hard to get a good team every 4 or 5 years. It's harder to get one every 4, 5, 6, 7, just continually. But I do think that the portal definitely helps because it gives you the option to get older guys right away.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned earlier, Ben, about the proximity to big population, whether it's Detroit or Columbus in Ohio State's case. Just recruiting in general for Penn State football, basketball, it just seems like the barrier is it's central PA. It's the middle of farm country. How does Penn State now turn the success of the basketball program into more of a recruiting destination? I think about Syracuse and how they did it for all the years. I mean, in the middle of the snow belt of the Great Lakes, I mean, can Penn State do this? Can they turn the corner? Can it become more of a recruiting destination for Midwest or big city kids?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be the challenge there of what State College is and what it isn't. I made the trip to Madison for that game, the Wisconsin game earlier this year. And you're just struck every once in a while when you go to other Big Ten cities, which obviously I've done for football, but not as much for basketball. And you're like, man, this is just such a different place. And that's a good thing. And it's frankly a challenge at times for Penn State. But I do think that the program's never going to be a place where you just land top 10 kids. It's never going to turn into that. You've got to find guys like Jalen Pickett. Maybe you find Jalen Pickett a few years ago and develop him. Maybe you find a guy like Seth Lundy, like they did in Philadelphia, and you bring him along. And I think that, recruiting gets better. Recruiting becomes more of a destination point, and you see guys that they've had visits. I think that's a big thing too. Is you're not going to land guys every time, but at least they're on campus. You're going to miss the shots that you don't take, to steal the phrase in that regard. So I think for Penn State, I think winning helps. Kids will put up with a whole lot of things if you're winning basketball games. I think that you can see that in college football, that there's lots of places that are maybe no one's ever been like, I'd really love to live in Starkville. But if Mississippi State was really good, and I've been to Starkville, and they're nice people and everything. But if you win, people will show up. So I think that, that definitely helps Penn State. There's always going to be hurdles there because some kids are just going to want to be in a city. Some kids are going to want to be in a bigger market. But I think at the end of the day, if you're winning, if you're doing it consistently, there's always going to be that niche for guys that want to come to a place like Penn State.
And, back to Micah Shrewsbury, he can recruit, he can coach, he seems to have it all. Just in terms, though, of this year's team, as we get ready to start the tournament here, in your opinion, is this the most talented team Penn State has had in 5, 10, 20 years? I mean, what do you think, talent-wise, they have going into this thing?
I think they're the most – it's a good question, because I think that there's an argument to be made that the team that won the NIT in terms of having Mike Watkins and Tony Carr and Lamar Stevens and those guys, that maybe pound for pound, some of those guys are more talented as basketball players. But I think in terms of experience, in terms of just sort of the vibe and the sort of ability that they really know how they want to play, and they're willing to do that, and everyone knows their role and everyone knows their job, and they try and do it to the best of their ability. I think that that's really what matters a lot more to some extent than talent. I mean, if you can't shoot the ball and you suck at defense, that obviously comes back to hurt you in the long run. But I think for Penn State, they're talented, they're experienced, they're old, and they know what they're doing, and they lean into it. So talented, maybe not pound for pound, but certainly depth-wise and guys they can use and guys who know what they're doing, I think they're certainly up there in that department.
So, we mentioned the talent on the team. The talent on the bench, though, is Micah Shrewsbury, and I'm sure your Twitter feed's been loaded with this. I saw you replied to a few of these over the last few days. But will Penn State make the investment and move forward with Micah Shrewsbury? Is it smart, though, at this point to do that on just one run, 2 years of a record, but one big run? I mean, is this the opportunity the program's been looking for, or do they kind of hold pat and see if he does stay or not?
I mean, I think you always have to be proactive with coaches that you want to keep at the end of the day. And Penn State's, there's no part of Penn State's thinking that's going to say we would be okay with Micah Shrewsbury leaving tomorrow. So, from that perspective, I think, you want to find out what the number is or what the resources are. Because really, both my understanding and my just general inclination is that it's not so much about how much Micah Shrewsbury is getting paid. I don't think, no one's ever turned down a raise and no one's ever been disappointed to have more money, but I don't really think it's about the money. Now, if somebody's going to offer him twice as much as he's getting paid to Penn State to go deal with their problems, maybe he takes it. But I think if you are Micah Shrewsbury, the things that you want have to do with NIL, they have to do with recruiting, they have to do with what's most reasonable to change around the Jordan Center as you can. That's a difficult situation because Penn State technically is only co-owners of that building, so they can't just do everything they want on a whim. Some people, just for a matter of trivia, might not realize that Penn State Athletics pays rent to put their offices in the Jordan Center, which is part of the reason why they want to take their offices out of the Jordan Center, because they can stop paying the Jordan Center just to print papers and exist there. So, that's a long-winded answer, but I think, it's a challenge in a marketplace where guys that do well are going to be wanted. But I think if you're Penn State, you say, what do we need to do to keep you? And if you're Micah Shrewsbury, you say, I'm a head coach of a Big Ten program. Penn State's maybe not the nicest or sexiest place in terms of history and what have you, but if you can have years like this more often than not, it's not a bad gig to have, and certainly it's not a bad athletic department to be a part of.
No, especially with new TV deals and everything coming in. I mean, as you pointed out, Penn State does have the money. Speaking of that, let's talk about, you mentioned it too, NIL. What about the money possibly being invested in the basketball program in terms of NIL? We have a bit of an idea of how crazy it is on the football side of things, but what is NIL and the landscape there like for basketball right now? Not just with Penn State, but maybe everywhere else. What's happening across the league and the country with NIL deals in terms of basketball players?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, obviously NIL is not where it can be for Penn State. I think in general and with basketball, I think it's gotten better. I think Pat Kraft and Sandy Barber, to her credit, both have done things or did things that improved that situation for Penn State over the last year. I think it's one of those things where everyone's kind of figuring it out on the fly a little bit. For Penn State, there's a real challenge ahead in terms of deciding how much money is enough money to invest in basketball, because there are going to be programs like Michigan and Michigan State, just go down the list of most programs in the Big Ten that are really good at basketball. Their bang for their buck is going to go a little bit further than Penn State, because there's a higher road to climb. There's more challenges to overcome. And in the world of the college football playoff expanding, every dollar that you spend on something else is a dollar that you don't spend on football. And if you're Penn State, you've got to make a decision about how you want to prioritize your money, because they make a lot of it, but they also spend a lot of it. So it's not like they're just sitting around in a Scrooge McDuck kind of bathtub with just money to throw around. Now, at the end of the day, it's all accounting. It's all about where you put certain things in certain buckets. But NIL can be better. And I think if you ask Micah Shrewsbury today, what are the two things he's concerned about? It would be keeping Texas A&M off the free throw line, and it would be NIL. So I think, I think you definitely have to invest there. What that number looks like, I think, remains to be seen, but it certainly can be better than it is right now.
So you just mentioned Texas A&M. I want to sneak in a quick basketball question before we hop into football. What does this matchup look like for Thursday night? I mean, Penn State's in the tournament. Can they make some noise now in this first round, or is Texas A&M an up-and-comer here? A sexy head coach name. SEC seems to be building something basketball-wise. Is this a tough matchup for the Nittany Lions?
I mean, I think unless you're a 1 or 2 seed, every matchup's going to be tough. But I think that, aside from that answer, I think it works in Penn State's favor a little bit that Zach Edey doesn't play for Texas A&M. That's a big plus. I think it helps for Penn State that Texas A&M's two best players, or two leading scorers at least, are both shorter than 6'4". They're a physical team. They get to the free throw line a lot. They know how to score around the basket, but they don't shoot that well from outside. They don't shoot that well from mid-range. So I think if Penn State can keep Texas A&M off the free throw line, if it can hold Texas A&M to shots further and further away from the basket, that works in their favor. And I think that it helps that Penn State's, I look back, I'm an Eagles fan. You look back to when the Eagles won the Super Bowl, they weren't always the best team, but they had immaculate vibes. They just really loved playing together. And I think that this Penn State team has that going for them. I can't really speak to that for Texas A&M. It's entirely possible that they have the best vibes in the tournament as well. And it'll just be see who can be the happiest the entire time kind of thing. But I do think that Penn State has all the pieces to beat Texas A&M. I think that's the good thing about playing in the Big Ten. It's not like you haven't seen good teams before. It's not like you haven't played physical teams before. So there's not going to be very many teams in the bracket that are going to be better than what Penn State's seen. And if Penn State gets the whole way to playing Alabama in the national title game, at that point, I don't know what I'll have done. It will be a weird time to be alive, but everyone can worry about that bridge when we get there.
Brett and I keep saying it's a weird time to be alive between the Eagles' success, the Phillies, and now Penn State men's basketball and football all in 1 year. It's been a little overwhelming. So let's switch gears to football. Penn State, a top 10 program according to a lot of preseason rankings, and there's a huge change at quarterback. We all know about it. We've all talked about it throughout the last few months. What are you hearing about the program as we enter into spring ball? Is Drew Aller really this second coming?
Yeah, for his sake, I hope he is. Just because it's going to be a long couple years if he isn't. I mean, I think the biggest thing that Penn State has to do right now is make sure that they've got the things around him for him to be successful. I think we're all waiting to see what Drew looks like in moments that really matter. He got thrown out there, obviously in moments that mattered, but let's check out a 3rd and 5 against Ohio State in the third quarter, down 3. Those are the moments that we're not going to know anything about Drew until he gets there. I think talent-wise and skill-wise, he can make any pass that you need him to make. I think he strikes me. I talked to him 2 weeks ago. He strikes me as a smart kid. Now, smart kid, nice kid, doesn't mean he can read zone defenses. We'll find that out as well. But if we give him the benefit of being as good as people say he is or can be, then the question is, can Penn State run the ball? We think that they can. Can Penn State catch the ball? I think that we think that they can, but there's maybe a little bit to prove there. And can they play defense? And can their offensive line block? I think there's reason to be optimistic about all of those parts. You're just going to have to see it all come together. Do I think Penn State's a top 10 team? I think that's fair to start the season. But, like any top 10 team or really any team in the rankings early in the season, you just have to go out and prove it.
Yeah, and you have to prove it against the big boys. We'll ask you about that in just a bit. But besides just the players and Aller coming in here, coaching changes, right? They're a part of every offseason. Penn State's been lucky here. No coordinator changes, but they did announce their D-line coach hire yesterday. Probably not surprising. Deion Barnes been retained, promoted. Your thoughts on this hire? Seems to make at least some sense from the outside.
Yeah, I think this is as much about retaining Deion as it is what he brings to the table as a coach. And I think everyone anticipates that he's a very good defensive line coach. And obviously, Penn State wouldn't hire him if he wasn't. But, he's a really good recruiter. He's got the advantage of youth. I believe he just turned 30, so that makes me feel old.
Us too.
Likewise.
And, he's the up and coming guy. And I think if you have up and coming guys in an area of need in the coaching ranks, you make that move. I think it's always a challenge because the defensive line coaching fraternity, for whatever reason, is always incredibly deep. There are a ton of great defensive line coaches around the country. So can you find someone who, quote unquote, is better than Deion Barnes? Maybe. But I think this was a sensible hire for Penn State to make. I think it was continuity based. And I think that's something that we've learned about James Franklin and really, to a certain extent, every head coach in America, is that the fewer changes that you can make in the offseason, especially the fewer changes that you can make that you weren't expecting, the better off you are, because the teams and the programs that are able to maintain continuity year to year have the most success. So I think Deion certainly earned it. And I also think he checks off all the boxes for Penn State being able to make a change without having to really make a change.
So you mentioned the catching of the ball situation, and I really do think a lot of this next year comes down to wide receiver play, throwing the ball off this strong run game. Do you think the wide receiver room is up to the task, or is this where the team just will continue to fall short against the Ohio States and the Michigans, where you have to put up a lot of points?
Yeah, I think, like you said, the big advantage for Penn State this year is going to be the fact that they're not necessarily going to have to be a throw-first team. I think in this day and age, you obviously have to be able to pass the ball. But I think when you've got two running backs like Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, you have the ability to take a lot of pressure off of your receivers, a lot of pressure off your quarterbacks. And that obviously helps, especially with a younger guy. The receiver room, I've always been a big fan of what I think Keandre Lambert-Smith can become. I think he can be the kind of player that he was in the Rose Bowl, the kind of player that he was at the end of the year. I think he just has to find that consistency and even-keeledness in his game. And if he does that, I think he can be really good. Obviously, I don't know if there's an answer to the question of who's the next Mitchell Tinsley or Jahan Dotson kind of player. I think you'd have to start with Keandre because he's the oldest guy in the room in that regard. I think Amari Evans is super, super fast. Harrison Wallace, or Trey Wallace, as he's known, I think is another guy that can be incredibly consistent for them. And then there's guys like Caden Saunders, who we heard a lot about on the recruiting trail, but haven't really seen do anything on the field so far. Obviously as a redshirt freshman or a freshman last year, a true freshman last year, he just wasn't part of that rotation. So I think the guys are there. I think it's going to start and end with what they can do with Keandre. But I think behind him, there's a lot of talent. And, like you said, you've got to be able to catch the ball. You look at Trace McSorley's last year at Penn State. Obviously, there's a lot of things different about that 2018 than 2016 and 2017. But one of the biggest issues that team had is it dropped a lot of passes that it shouldn't. So if Drew's going to make great passes, somebody's got to be on the other end to catch them. And if they're not, there's only so much Drew can do about that.
Yeah, and new wide receivers coach, a couple of transfers too, could add all to that. I want to talk about defense for a second. How can this unit be much better than last year? We saw some improvement with Manny Diaz coming in. Uh, can he offer even more in year two? And with some of the players coming back, what's your take on that side of the ball as Diaz, tries to get even better moving into his second year in state college?
I mean, my standing opinion on Penn State's defense has been until Penn State fields a bad defense, I'm going to assume that it's going to field a good one. And I think Manny Diaz did uh, a great job last year. I think that defense spoke for itself. In particular, at times, I think Penn State's offense helped it out enough that it didn't feel like one of those years where Penn State's defense had to hold serve the entire season. Obviously there are question marks. There's obviously a lot of areas they've got to answer. I think in terms of defensive line, in terms of finding more depth at linebacker. Losing a guy like Jair Brown. Sorry, I've been so basketball focused. You're making me think about football too.
Right.
But I think the fact that they bring back Curtis Jacobs, I think that that's big because he's one of those guys that, was kind of on the fringe a little bit in terms of staying and going. And I think when you can keep those fringe guys, you end up being a better defense for it. So, there's going to be things for them to figure out and, to be able to replace a guy like PJ Mustipher and stuff like that. I think Chop Robinson is going to be fine. There's lots of different guys everywhere. Penn State football on the defensive side of the ball has always had guys that are maybe the answer to the void, and they've almost always turned out to be that. Now, not everyone's going to just replace Micah Parsons and suddenly become Micah Parsons 2.0, but I do think that they've got good coaching. Abdul Carter obviously is another guy to be excited about. I mean, maybe he is the guy to replace Micah.
Right.
But I think that they at every level they've got questions, and at every level they've got answers. That when you say that, you go, okay, that makes sense. So I think for Penn State, you should feel pretty good about where you're at, even if you have a little bit of work to do.
Now, this next question it's a little loaded, but it kind of summarizes some of the key points you've made throughout the interview here. We know that college football is undergoing massive changes. You've got the NIL, you've got conference realignment, new TV deals, and we may not be done with conference realignment. You've got a 12-team playoff starting next year, one more year of the 4-team, and then the 12-team kicks off. In your view, and in covering this team for as long as you have been, is Penn State ready to compete and be a player in all of these arenas? And, can it really be one of the top programs in the sport consistently and make the playoff consistently and compete for national titles consistently?
I mean, I think by and large, the answer is yes, because you look at outside of COVID, outside of the sort of year that came after that Penn State's been one of the better programs in the country consistently. The hard part is when you only get 4 teams in the playoffs and they're mostly the same 4 teams, give or take. It's just hard to kind of punch your way through. Now, the challenge for college football, I think, a little bit is going to be how we feel about teams that make the playoffs but then don't do anything. Because the challenge of you have to beat Alabama, you have to beat some of these really good programs. That's not going to go away. You're just going to get to put off having to deal with that for a round or two. So I think that Penn State is well positioned as anybody to be successful in college football right now. The challenge is the same that everyone else is facing, which is how do you turn into Georgia? And the answer is you probably don't. You probably just kind of have to have enough things go your way enough times. You have to develop players. You have to recruit players. You have to hope that other teams get worse because that's part of it too. Is that Clemson was beating the pants off of everybody a few years ago, and now they're just kind of better than most people, but not exactly terrifying. So I think that, it's a couple different things. And I think that's really, if you're James Franklin, I think one of the things that he's tried to hammer home that people haven't always received well, which is it's way better to always be really good and come up short than be really good once every 10 years and then still come up short because eventually you're going to knock through that door. If you have a lot of opportunities, it goes back to recruiting for basketball. If you have a lot of opportunities to sign good prospects, eventually it's going to happen. If you're Penn State football, if you have a lot of opportunities to make the noise in the playoffs, eventually it's going to happen. So, I'm not going to sit here and say the expansion is suddenly going to mean that Penn State's going to be in the Final Four every year, but I do think it means that they're going to be in the playoffs. I do think that that's going to help recruiting. And really one of the things that I'm curious about is when programs don't have a premium on making the playoffs, which you figure 4 or 5 programs right now are the teams that go to the playoffs. When there's 12 or 15 of those, does that spread out more of the talent? Because now you don't have, sort of the niche of saying, well, come here because you'll make the playoffs. If you go anywhere else, you won't. If Penn State can make the playoffs and it doesn't have to beat Ohio State and it doesn't always have to beat Michigan either, does that help on the recruiting trail? I guess we'll see. If I'm smart or just dumb, check back in a couple of years. That's generally my approach to everything I say. But I do think that Penn State's in a good position.
Well, I think those are all fair points. And by the way, Georgia, I mean, they were a pretty good team, 9 or 10 wins every year, hadn't won a title in 40 years. Got the right head coach in there, and it did turn around. So, yeah, I think it's just sometimes it takes patience. So we do have one more question for Ben.
Yeah, no, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying here, Ben, about spreading out the talent, making it happen with a top 12 rather than a top 4. But switching gears a little bit, you get to cover the games. You're in the press box, so maybe not as exposed to the elements, but do you have any favorite weather stories from covering Penn State football at all the different Big Ten locations?
Or least favorite.
Yeah, or least favorite.
There's actually a couple to come to mind, and they all involve Michigan State for whatever reason.
Of course.
Every time they play at Michigan State, it is just god awful. Yeah, I mean, I think the weather delay thing seems like kind of a cop out because everyone sort of had to participate in that at the same time. I think my favorite part of the weather delay was at Michigan State in the press box. You just get a voucher for food, and it's like a pretzel or a hot dog. You can buy other stuff, but we're in the media, so we're taking all the free food we can get. And
Amen.
We understand.
It's going into its second or third hour of a delay, and people are just like bartering pretzels and things. And Le'Veon Bell, of all people, just like shows up in the press box, wandering around looking for a voucher. And it's like, do you not make like way more money than the rest of us? Like, you can afford a pretzel, my man.
That's funny.
That was funny. I think, though, in terms of like a weather experience that maybe didn't translate the same way on TV as the delay did, was also Michigan State. And the last time they played at Michigan State, when it was just snowing incredibly hard, and it was cool from the press box because obviously everybody knows that when it's snowing hard in front of you, that it's kind of annoying and it's pretty and everything, but you can still see moderately well. But way up in the press box, there's way more snow between you and the field, and Penn State's wearing white uniforms on the road, and you would just not out and out lose guys, but it was just like the most camouflaged sort of thing to look at. I have a ton of pictures where it's just like Jahan Dotson, and all you can see are like his face, and then everything else just sort of disappeared into the white. So yeah, I think that's probably the first two that come to mind. It was also really hot at not Auburn. Where did they play? Yeah, Auburn.
Auburn.
In a long day. And when they played at Auburn down on that field, I think that's something that people don't always appreciate too, is the temperature at field level sometimes can be just heinously hot in the right conditions because it'll just bounce off that field. It's also just hot to begin with. So yeah, that's kind of the two extremes in terms of really warm and really cold experiences.
Well, you mentioned how rough it was for that Michigan State game. How bad was it for the Northwestern game in person this year at Beaver Stadium? I mean, it looked like a total slog out there.
Yeah, that stuff is like quintessentially disgusting Big Ten weather. That's one of those games where people like, I'm in the press box, so I'm pretty comfortable, but people at home that are like complaining about stuff, and you can talk all you want about the ability to overcome adversity and stuff like that, but nobody wanted to be there. No one wanted to be on that field. No one wanted to be in the stands for that. It was just disgusting. And it does remind me of a somewhat weather-related item. A few years earlier, I don't remember the game, but it was so cold that the bathroom pipes in the press box froze. So you had to take the elevator downstairs to use a different potentially frozen bathroom. Welcome to Beaver Stadium. So that was another cold weather. It's definitely more cold weather stories for Penn State than warm ones.
I
that
totally
is for
agree.
sure.
I will say this much. I will gladly exchange a USC November game for a Michigan State November game, regardless of the location. Like you said, it's a magnet for bad weather.
You're right. That seems to be coming down the pike, too.
Yep.
So, Ben Jones, we thank you for everything and for stopping by Weather Wagers, for chatting about the weather and all things Penn State, including basketball and football. Tell everybody where they can find you and read your stuff.
So it's pretty straightforward. I'm at statecollege.com, and if you want to see me say dumb things in real time on Twitter, It's Ben_Jones88. Going out to Des Moines. I guess I'm not sure when this will air, but I will be out in Des Moines for the NCAA tournament, and then I guess we'll see if they end up in Kansas City for the Sweet 16. But you got to cross one bridge at a time.
Well, yeah, no, this comes out this week, so we'll keep it timely and give him a follow. Everybody, thanks for stopping on, Ben, and come on back when you have some time.
Appreciate you having me, fellas.
All right, a big thank you there to Ben Jones. Really appreciate his time. StateCollege.com. He told you all the ways you can reach him, and he's been a busy guy. I mean, there's been a lot to cover with Penn State athletics as of late.
Man, I agree, and just a fun interview. He's been around for so long, and going to practices and covering the team, and going to these pressers that Franklin had yesterday, and trying to, much like Audrey Snyder, much like our Ali Barubi that was here there yesterday too. These beat writers go up and they try to sniff out some of these storylines, and so it's fun to kind of get their perspective on things. And Ben was a great guest, so we thank him for that. And speaking of that, a great guest.
Yes,
who did you
what
secure?
A transition.
Who did you secure for next week?
Yeah, so very excited about this guest, Ray Didinger, the one, the only. I mean, when I think of Eagles, I think of Ray. I think of Merrill Reese, the voices to me of Eagles fandom. So he is a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame Writers Honor Roll. He'll be talking to us all things Eagles. He was telling me that he is working on his draft prep. So perhaps he has some nuggets of information. 76 years old, still at it, graduate of Temple University. So I know he's written some great books, obviously, over the years, writing about the Eagles, all things Eagles. He knows the history inside and out. And more importantly for mid-staters, he was here in Hershey, which I wish was still a thing, when they would do their preseason workouts in Hershey. Imagine going just a few miles down the road from Harrisburg and seeing the Philadelphia Eagles practice in Hershey, PA.
That's just
So
fun
we're going
stuff.
to ask him about that stuff.
Ray's going to have a great
Pretty
perspective.
Cool.
We're excited to chat with him. That'll be coming your way next week on the podcast, so don't miss it.
And I'm sure by that point we'll have a little bit of a clearer picture of free agency for the Eagles. Real quick, I want to run this down. So who are we keeping so far as of Wednesday? We have James Bradbury in the fold. We have Boston Scott, the giant killer. We have Jason Kelsey, the heart and soul of the Eagles. Brandon Graham, another. I mean, he will be the longest-term Eagle, I think, if he plays 10 games this year. So that's a big signing. And then outside the organization, they bring in Rashad Penny, who is a running back for Seattle, who's had some injury concerns, but when he plays, he's a rocket in the offense. Who we've lost so far, T.J. Edwards to the Bears, Javon Hargrave to the 49ers on a mega deal, which
a lot of money there.
I think they're happy to walk away from that. Andre Dillard with the Tennessee Titans going there. Marcus Epps with the Raiders. Good luck to the Raiders. I'm not sure they're going to have much going on this year. And Kazir White going to the Cardinals, rejoining Mr. Jonathan Gannon there. So that's the quick rundown. And as of this podcast, we've now learned that Darius Slay is being released. We still don't know the full ramifications thereof. Remember, they did release Fletcher Cox last year and bring him back.
It could be a restructure, but they say they're releasing him because they couldn't come to an agreement on a new deal. So you never know where that might lead.
He tweeted, "Love you, Philly, but let's see what's next."
Right. So who knows? And there's got to be a market. I mean, that's the thing. These guys could be on the open market, but the market will dictate what happens. And there's no guarantee that there's a greener pasture out there for him.
True.
No, you're right. But that's where things stand. We're going to talk to Ray, too, about the draft. That is inching our way closer. But before that, real quick, as we wrap things up, give me your pick, each of you, for the NCAA tournament. Who wins?
Alabama.
Me, too. That's who I picked in my bracket.
Seems like the easy one, but you guys know where my affinity lies. I think it's going to be a rock chalk repeat.
Okay.
Go Kansas Jayhawks.
I mean, they're also, I've seen some pundits pick them. I've seen some pundits pick Penn State to go pretty deep, too.
I've seen Sweet 16,
fun
I've
to
seen
watch
Elite
them make
8.
a push.
But, when it comes to basketball, we should note that David Shiner is a Kansas Jayhawk.
Hey, it's where
lifer.
the game was created.
That's correct.
You know?
Yep. But watch out for Kansas State.
Yeah, the Big 12 in general. I mean,
Good ball.
they're loaded almost 12 teams deep. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I have Kansas State going pretty far too, so that would be fun. But yeah, never doubt Kansas.
One of the
Bill
blue
Self,
bloods, you know.
Yeah,
That's right.
they are. But I mean, so is Kentucky, and We'll see how they do.
Mr. John Calipari, how about it?
Well, he better make a Final Four this year.
That money is starting
that up.
A linchpin in the thorn of Kentucky's side there in the athletic department.
Yes, it is. But we're excited. It's the off season from what we normally do here. But we're loaded with guests. We're loaded with fun things to talk about, including March Madness, which we have until April, including spring baseball, which will be starting and really ramping up with opening day soon, and including the draft, which is coming quickly. So, gentlemen, as always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, too, out there for listening. Remember, Dan, remind them all the ways they can get us here.
Absolutely. As we end out, you can reach out to us, weatherwagers@gmail.com, Facebook, Twitter. You're at meteorologist Brett Thacker on Facebook, at Brett Thack, ABC27, Twitter, Instagram, and there I am, meteorologist Dan Tomaso, Facebook, Twitter, at Doppler Dan, Instagram, Doppler Dan, and real quick there, Mr. Shiner, what are you?
At Shinetastic17.
All right.
Easy. Weatherwagers@gmail.com. We want to hear from you, and we have, and some of you writing in some nice comments. So that's a wrap for this week. We'll see you next week with the Ray Diddinger, and listen, it's almost spring.
Enjoy March Madness, everybody.